General Hospital spoilers for Tuesday, May 13th tease that in the quiet room of Jordan, the soft lighting could do nothing to soothe the turmoil swirling inside Curtis. He sat silently at the edge of the chair, hands clasped, eyes sunken with exhaustion, as if the world was crumbling piece by piece in his mind. And there was nothing left to hold on to the composure he once prided himself on. In front of Jordan, the woman he once trusted most, Curtis finally let go of his hardened mask, revealing the layers of anxiety that were slowly eroding the strength and conviction of a man who had always carried the weight of protection on his shoulders. He whispered, more like a confession, not seeking forgiveness, that Drew, his former comrade, a man who once stood in the same trenches with him, was no longer someone he could trust. Curtis didn't need black and white evidence to confirm it. He could feel it in every subtle move Drew made around Trina and Kai. Drew didn't need to shout to apply pressure. Didn't need to show his hand to threaten, he only needed to stand in the shadows, giving just a few commands to make everything around Curtis begin to shake. And Curtis, who had grown accustomed to facing the underworld, had never felt so helpless. Trina, the daughter he loved more than anyone, was now caught in a string of strange events. Small signs, like her being suddenly subjected to a psychological evaluation at the hospital, or the intermittent data losses in her school research projects, initially seemed like coincidences. But as Curtis began to connect the dots, he realized this was a deliberately constructed game. And Kai, the young student facing a complex surgery, was the most sensitive piece of this whole scheme. Curtis suspected Drew was using Kai's medical condition as leverage, coercing Trina into collaborating in research or operations she never chose to be a part of. A person's survival had now been turned into a tool to manipulate another's mind, and Drew, the man who once spoke of justice and freedom, was the one orchestrating it all. Jordan listened without interrupting, her expression growing graver with each passing second. She had known Drew, as a colleague, as someone she once believed still held a moral line. But if what Curtis said was true, if Drew was indeed controlling the medical data network, tampering with Trina's psychological records, and manipulating Kai's condition, then this was no longer a personal threat. It was a silent coup, where law and power were no longer determined by justice, but by insane calculations wrapped in a terrifyingly smart and legal facade. Curtis continued, his voice now lower, as if he himself was struggling to admit that he had been too late. He hadn't seen Drew's transformation soon enough, had believed his old friend was simply trying to regain control after personal losses. But now he knew, this wasn't personal anymore. This was about absolute power, a quiet restructuring in which Drew was replacing those in power with ones who would either bow down or could no longer resist. Trina, with her integrity and passion for research, was exactly the kind of person Drew couldn't allow to be free. She needed to be controlled. To be bound by a reasonable, cause that would keep her silent. Jordan took a deep breath, stood up, walked a few paces, then stopped in front of Curtis. She understood that if what he was saying was true, then it wasn't just Trina and Kai who were in danger, the entire operational structure of Port Charles was being infiltrated from within. And the scariest part was, no one in this town suspected Drew. He was too smart, too polite, too perfect in the public eye. But that only made Curtis feel even more isolated. No one believed him. No one thought Drew could become the kind of man who would use patients as hostages, data as weapons, and family ties as psychological traps. What Curtis was sharing was no longer just a confession between old friends. It was a roadmap to an impending explosion. A calculated upheaval was unfolding beneath the calm surface of Port Charles. And at its center were two young people unaware they were victims of a terrifyingly well-programmed plan. Curtis was out of time. And Jordan understood that if they didn't act now, if they didn't stop Drew before he completed his endgame, it wouldn't just be Trina and Kai who'd fall, but the very concepts of family, law, and justice they had once believed in would be buried under a system driven by obsession, fear, and chillingly precise manipulations. Meanwhile, Sonny made a move that stunned all of Port Charles, especially Laura, who had once believed she understood all the power games in the city. But what had just happened showed that Sonny was no longer acting like an old-school crime boss driven by instinct. He had become a true strategist, willing to forge unexpected alliances to achieve things others wouldn't dare dream of. By securing a secret deal with Sidwell, a controversial and dangerous figure in underground finance, Sonny had placed the entire city at the brink of a strategic detonation. But the one most deeply shaken was Laura. She had never imagined Sonny would partner with Sidwell, whom she had always seen as a hidden threat to the moral structure she was striving to preserve in Port Charles. To her, Sidwell represented everything rotten: economic manipulation, covert political control, and dark schemes that no legal system could ever fully grasp. And now, with Sonny, once the natural enemy of forces like Sidwell, becoming his partner, all the faith Laura had placed in the fragile balance of local power collapsed. The deal between Sonny and Sidwell wasn't just a financial transaction. It was a redefinition of influence. It allowed Sonny to legitimize his shadowy investments and expand his reach into areas previously off-limits: media, healthcare, even the local administrative system. Sidwell didn't just provide resources, he helped Sonny systematically dismantle the political barriers Laura had once erected to shield the town from corruption. And the most terrifying part was, Sonny did all of this legally, leaving no trace that could get him prosecuted. Laura, upon learning this, could hardly believe her ears. She felt as if she had awoken in a world where moral rules had been flipped upside down, where someone once outside the law now rose to power in a chillingly legal way. But beyond the shock of strategy, Laura began to sense something far more dangerous. Her own role as mayor was now in jeopardy. Because if she opposed it, if she publicly voiced dissent against the Sonny-Sidwell alliance, she wouldn't just face one power, she'd face two: one who ruled the underground with brute force, and one who manipulated the financial system from the shadows. The calculated shift was no longer a theory. It was reshaping Port Charles every day. Civic councils were being influenced. Social projects were delayed. City budgets were suddenly redirected. And though no one dared say it out loud, everyone knew, Sonny was no longer under surveillance. He was becoming part of the power structure. With an ally like Sidwell, he could now manipulate the very system that once stood against him. And Laura, though still the head of government, was being pushed back step by step. The bills she once championed were now being vetoed. Old allies began retreating for fear of association. And while Laura struggled to protect the city through transparency and ethics, a new empire was forming behind her, a regime where Sonny and Sidwell stood on the same front line, controlling everything by making people like Laura obsolete. This wasn't just a political clash. It was the beginning of a covert war, between belief and pragmatism, between ideals and control. Between the light Laura had fought to preserve and the cunning darkness Sonny was now legalizing. And as these two worlds began to collide, it would take just one misstep, one overreaction, one wrong name spoken at the wrong moment, for everything to explode. And Port Charles would never be the same again. On a rare quiet afternoon amidst the rising chaos in Port Charles, Carly decided to go see Lulu, carrying a truth that, if not handled with care, could become the catalyst that would blow apart an already fragile web of relationships, and possibly trigger irreversible consequences. Carly wasn't the type to scare easily or worry excessively. But this time, she understood that what was simmering inside Lulu, after learning that Gio might be Dante's biological son, was something capable of tearing down every last boundary of safety. This wasn't just rumor or vague suspicion anymore. Carly held the real pieces of a deadly truth, and she knew that if Lulu discovered it on her own, especially in her current mental state, the cost wouldn't just be a family argument. It would be war. And it would spread like wildfire through dry woods. Carly had been watching Lulu closely ever since she awoke from her long coma, step by step reclaiming her memory, her emotions, and her control over her life. But what Carly saw, more clearly than anyone else, was that Lulu was no longer the woman she used to be. She hadn't returned with the compassionate gaze and warm heart that once soothed Dante's tension or resolved Spencer family conflicts. No, This new Lulu was cold-eyed, sharp-voiced, and haunted by everything she had missed, everything stolen from her, and everyone who stayed silent when they should have spoken. And leading that list was Dante, her former husband. The man who had promised honesty above all else. Now, as the truth about Gio came to light, not through Dante himself but through evasive actions, twisted words, and avoiding eyes, he became the face of betrayal. Carly had tried to speak gently, to warn Lulu with calm reasoning that if she didn't hold on to her clarity, if she let emotion take over, it wouldn't just be Gio who got hurt. Lulu would lose everything she'd been trying to rebuild, trust, respect, and the strength she was slowly reclaiming. But Lulu didn't listen. Her eyes darkened at the mention of Gio. To her, that name now symbolized double betrayal, not just from Dante, who hid the truth, but from Brooklyn. Once an ally and now the keeper of the most devastating secret of her life. Carly knew Gio wasn't at fault. He was the greatest victim in this entire ordeal, born and raised in lies. Hidden by his own parents to serve their goals, their reputations, and their selfish fears. But Carly also knew that in Lulu's eyes, reason no longer had a place. Lulu didn't want explanations. She wanted justice, her version of it, raw, exposed, and with a price to be paid. She wanted Dante to hurt the way she had when she woke up and realized she had been cut out of a life that should have revolved around her. And Gio, the child who had never known her, never called her anything but Miss Lulu, was now a symbol of everything stolen from her, memory, motherhood, and the truth. What Carly feared most was that Lulu would act without a plan. Because Lulu's danger didn't lie in explosive actions, it was in the calm, controlled rage she now carried. Lulu didn't scream. She didn't lash out. She simply gathered information. Approached everyone involved, studied their reactions, and slowly pieced together the whole picture. Carly knew that once Lulu held the complete truth, she wouldn't keep it to herself.
She would let the world know, and she would do it in a way no one expected. Not at a family meeting, but possibly through the media, in front of the hospital board.
Or at a courtroom hearing she might petition, seeking custody not of Rocco, but of Gio. What worried Carly even more was how Lulu saw Gio. No longer the sweet little boy. In Lulu's eyes, Gio was now a product of betrayal, a symbol of failure, a reminder that while she slept, the people she trusted most rewrote the story of her life. And Carly knew that if Lulu wasn't stopped, with reason, with real love, with someone strong enough to make her pause and see things clearly, Port Charles would witness an unprecedented crisis. A family would be destroyed. A boy would be torn from the only memories he had. And the wounds Lulu thought had healed, would begin to bleed again. Carly wasn't sure if she could stop Lulu. But she knew one thing: if Lulu exploded, her fury wouldn't stop at Gio. It would spread to Dante, to Brooklyn, to Sonny, and to Carly herself. And by then, no one would be considered family anymore. There would only be betrayers, and those out for revenge. Jocelyn had made a promise. Not written down, not signed, not witnessed, but carved into her bones. A vow forged in the dark when everything around her felt like it was collapsing. That was the moment she understood that, if she wanted to survive, not just physically, but with her honor, identity, and dignity intact, she had to hold on to that promise like a final shield. She had vowed to protect identities, guard the mission, and never betray the commitment she made when she joined the WSB. Above all, she had promised that no one, family, friend, or foe, would pull her from the path she had chosen once her feet had touched it. But that promise was now being stretched to its limit. As every force around her collided in a game with no more rules. Danny, the younger brother she once loved like blood, was the first to crack the cover. That unintentional betrayal, born of confusion, turned the spotlight on Jocelyn and Vaughn. The PCPD started watching. Dante grew suspicious. Lulu observed her every move. Carly remained silent, but her gaze was sharp as a blade. Meanwhile, the WSB, rather than protecting their agent, began to turn away. They considered removal. They wanted to erase her. They were calculating her value as if she were a data file to be permanently deleted when no longer useful. And under all this pressure, Jocelyn held firm to her promise. She revealed nothing.
She didn't cry, didn't flee, didn't flinch. Sleepless nights, Vaughn's tight grip on her hand after every exposed clue, cold stares from loved ones, none of it broke her.
It only strengthened her resolve. The obsession with protecting the secret had pushed her into a constant state of tension. She checked her phone 5 times before sending a message. Changed meeting spots with Vaughn 3 times in one afternoon. Encrypted every conversation, erased every temporary file after every call. She wasn't a student anymore. She was a living firewall, programmed to survive in a world where truth meant death. And Vaughn, once merely a handler, had become her indispensable partner. Between them, there was no longer a question of who was in charge or who protected whom. They were 2 halves of the same front, living, fighting, and guarding a secret that, if exposed, could destroy both the WSB and their families in a vicious undercurrent. But that closeness birthed something Jocelyn dared not acknowledge: feelings. She had never allowed herself to love while on a mission. But when Vaughn looked at her, when he silently wiped sweat from her brow after a long stakeout, when they sat together saying nothing at all, it cracked her, piece by piece. The bond between Jocelyn and Vaughn wasn't innocent, nor romantic by design. It was born of betrayal, loneliness, and the need to be fully known by one person who wouldn't judge. But that bond, once it grew, only made the mission more complicated. Jocelyn knew that one confession, one hug at the wrong time, even one glance held too long, could be recorded, tracked, weaponized. She wasn't allowed to love. But she also wasn't cold enough anymore to not hurt if Vaughn disappeared. And that's what made everything between them a ticking time bomb. Not just because the mission was at risk, but because, amid the footsteps of the WSB, Dante's scrutiny, Carly's warnings, and the organization's lethal silence, love was the only real thing. And the realest thing was also the most dangerous. Jocelyn had made a promise. But she had never promised to give up every emotion to keep it. And now, as everything hits its limit, files being decrypted, recordings reconstructed, ties to Vaughn uncovered, she must face the question she's been avoiding all along. Does the promise still matter, if the only thing keeping her alive is the one thing she cannot admit? And if the WSB acts, if Vaughn is taken, if her family turns away, will she keep the promise? Or will she break everything, to protect the one thing her heart will never betray? The answer, like everything in Jocelyn's life now, remains in the shadows. But one thing is clearer than ever: the promise is no longer a declaration of loyalty. It is a fateful scar dividing 2 people from a world they'll never fully belong to. And sooner or later, that scar will bleed. Trina finally opened up to Portia. No longer the tough, resilient girl who braved every upheaval alone, Trina sat across from her mother, her eyes a mixture of worry and profound exhaustion. What she was about to say wasn't just a confession, it was the breaking of the armor she had held onto for so long, about Kai, about the things left unsaid, and about an upcoming surgery that could change her life and the lives of those she loved forever. Trina sighed, her eyes drifting to the window, searching for answers among the streaks of rain sliding down the glass. She whispered that Kai was facing a threat far greater than anything Portia could imagine. The upcoming surgery wasn't just a medical procedure. It was a turning point, a life-or-death gamble. The doctors were optimistic, the treatment plan carefully laid out, but Trina knew the truth. Nothing was as certain as it seemed. Kai's condition wasn't just medical. He carried within him something few knew, a rare biological mutation that could make him the first human subject in a completely untested treatment. Clinical trials didn't exist. The stakes were immense. Portia went still as her daughter spoke. As a doctor, she understood the medical terminology, but when those words came from Trina's mouth, reason faded. Trina didn't speak in clinical language. She spoke from pain, with a heart weighed down. She told of sleepless nights by Kai's bedside. Of moments when he was in agony and only her presence could offer him relief. She spoke of Kai's eyes, always calm before others, but to her, they revealed the fear buried deep inside. And most devastatingly, Trina admitted that she had prepared herself to lose him at any moment. But what shocked Portia more than Kai's condition was Trina's plan. A tissue transplant, donating a part of herself to save him if things became critical. Trina didn't speak of it as a possibility. She had already signed the forms, completed the tests, and made her decision. That was why she had kept silent for so long. Because she didn't want interference. She didn't want her mother to stop her. She didn't want anyone, not even Spencer. Not even her closest friends, to shake her resolve. Portia, torn between a mother's heart and a doctor's conscience, felt herself unraveling. She had always believed Trina was strong, but never imagined her daughter was carrying the weight of a life-or-death decision that no one her age should ever face. And she knew well the risks of such a transplant, the chance of complications, rejection, the long-term toll on Trina's own health. But most of all, she saw something in her daughter's eyes that shattered her: acceptance. Trina was ready to give up everything, her safety, her future, even her life, to save one person. It was both an act of absolute love and a sign of terrifying obsession. Trina spoke, her voice no longer shaking, and said that if her mother tried to stop her, she would leave. She was an adult now. She had the right to choose. And she had chosen. This wasn't an emotional impulse. It was a calculated sacrifice. Because she knew, if Kai survived, he would live, with her as part of that life. But if he didn't, at least she could say she did everything possible. She couldn't live with herself if she had stood by and done nothing. Portia, tears falling silently, could no longer maintain the mask of rational motherhood. She pulled Trina into her arms, as if trying to hold on to her before everything spiraled beyond control.
She knew this surgery wasn't just for Kai. It was a surgery for their family, a test that, if they survived, would make them stronger than ever. But if they failed,
it might leave a scar that would never heal. In that moment, Portia was no longer a doctor. No longer a mother trying to take charge. She was simply a woman praying for a miracle, that the daughter she loved wouldn't have to pay the price for loving too deeply, in a world where those who love the most often bear the deepest wounds. And in that heavy, quiet room, both women understood. The future was no longer something to wait for. It was coming, fast, fierce, and with no time left for hesitation.